I think we can all agree that knights are always pretty badass on screen, but reality is rarely as cool as the movies make it out to be, although sometimes it's a little bit cooler. The image of the mounted knight is iconic. Shining armor, a colorful shield, a lance or gleaming sword, sitting atop a horse that could best be described as an absolute unit. We've been indoctrinated to believe that medieval knights spent their time in glorious charges, mowing down their enemies with a combined weight of their armor, horses, and badass, but ever chivalrous attitudes. But knights actually didn't ride big old draft horses. In fact, the horses most commonly ridden by knights would technically be classified as ponies in today's world. Once again, that's because a big heavy horse wasn't what knights needed. They were cavalrymen. The whole point was to be fast and mobile, not heavy and solid. Big solid horses were bred for pulling heavy things. In other words, for doing farm work and manual labor. No self-respecting knight would want to be associated with farming. Medieval war horses were fast, nimble, and powerful, and probably about 5 or 6 feet high. Not exactly the imposing image from the movies. Unless a few dozen were bearing down on you carrying bloodthirsty knights, of course. In a lot of movies, all the knights look like they shop at the same knight store. This is especially noticeable in battle scenes where knights are often depicted wearing exactly the same colors and sigils, the same armor, and carrying the same weapons. This makes sense to today's audiences because we grew up in the age of the modern professional army where soldiers wear uniforms, but knights were expected to provide their own, everything, which resulted in quite a range of fits. Less wealthy knights made do with whatever they could scrounge, and as a result, medieval armies were a lot more ragtag and basically like a modern bus stop than the movies make it seem. It wasn't until the 14th century that military uniforms began to be introduced, so in big movie battle scenes, having everyone wear the same thing makes it easier for the audience to understand who's who and what's happening. But in reality, it wasn't nearly as, uniform. When you think of knights, you think of armor, and when you think of armor, you probably think of plate armor. That's thanks to the movies, which almost always depict medieval knights wearing heavy plate armor, usually polished till it gleams. But that's not the way it was. Not only was armor in the Middle Ages made from a wide variety of materials, but plate armor, made from large articulated plates of metal, wasn't common until the end of the 14th century. Before then, the most common kind of battle armor, at least for warriors who could afford it, was chainmail, often combined with a metal hood around the torso. As time went on, new weapons led to new kinds of armor, and plate armor developed over time as a direct response to weaponry that rendered earlier armor less effective. But even after plate armor became more common, not every knight could afford it. Knighthood didn't come with a castle and a treasure chest, and there were plenty of super poor knights back in the Middle Ages. Being a knight was expensive, and the income streams were limited, especially between wars. Plate armor could cost anywhere from $8,000 to $250,000 in today's money, depending on its quality and customization.
What I offer is no life of privilege, but a life of service. And if you want it, it's yours.
Now, a lot of movies and TV shows make it seem like knighthood was an honor that anyone of sufficient rank could simply confer on someone else, usually by tapping a sword on their shoulders. While the dubbing or accolade ceremony was a real thing, it very rarely happened spontaneously. The path to knighthood began when you were as young as 7. You'd work as a page serving a local knight. After several years, you'd be promoted to squire, where your specific knightly education would begin.
Getting a bit old to be a squire, aren't we?
If you proved yourself in battle and were deemed worthy, another knight could then dub you a knight. In other words, it took time, work, and training to become a knight. Training to become a professional killing machine capable of withstanding the incredible physical demands of fighting in armor on horseback. And then you were bound to serve your liege lord for the rest of your life, even in peacetime. That meant managing farms, policing the population, and acting as an administrator and bureaucrat, none of which was covered in your years of training. Plenty of movies cast knights as villains, obviously, but somehow we still have the idea that being a knight meant you lived according to some sort of moral and ethical code. But being a medieval knight didn't require any of that stuff. What it did require was money, and lots of it. Armor, horses, and weapons were incredibly expensive, so knights would align with wealthy aristocrats who would then subsidize their knighthood. In exchange, the knights acted as hired muscle, putting down peasant rebellions, going to war with their lord's enemies, and doling out violence on demand. Many poor knights lived with their masters and worked as bodyguards, or basically like a private police force. And when these knights were set loose on the largely unarmed and disorganized peasants, they were often cruel, brutal, and unnecessarily violent. The bad behavior got worse in between wars when there was less to do. In fact, knights at large wreaking havoc wherever they went was one of the motivating factors behind the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries.
Come on! We need soldiers in the Holy Land!
Crusading gave the knights something to do besides terrorizing the population, and thinned out the ranks at the same time.
Hazardous business, these crusades. Many will be killed.
If your education concerning medieval knights comes exclusively from movies, you might think that the Code of Chivalry required them to be polite, well-mannered, and deferential to women at all times. The truth is, not so much. The idea that chivalry and knighthood go together is just a myth perpetuated by popular culture.
There she is, the embodiment of love, your Venus.
And how I hate her.
The real tea is that the knights in the Middle Ages were trained in the art of killing people. This theoretically occurred on the battlefield, but those sorts of skills do travel. Knights did their own thing when not directly engaged in combat, and their own thing often involved pillaging, killing, and burning everything in sight. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the Code of Chivalry was created to try and control this behavior, but not to spare the poor and the powerless. It was to protect the property of the lords on which the poor and the powerless toiled. Unfortunately, chivalry was only partially effective. While some knights played up their chivalrous behavior, most ignored it unless they were forced. Movies give the impression that all knights fought with swords, and swords only. Every single movie featuring knights has that scene where they pull their sword and wave it around, but in reality, knights used a wide variety of weapons, and swords were usually secondary. For one thing, armor was actually pretty effective. Swords are slashing and piercing weapons, but it's next to impossible to cut through metal armor. That's why people wore it. Slashing at metal doesn't work, and piercing requires the sort of careful aim and steady hand you don't often find on the battlefield. As for arrows, they were only effective if they hit a seam or gap in the plate. Instead, knights usually used primary weapons like the lance if on horseback because it had long reach and was capable of piercing armor at speed. Or they might wield a mace to bludgeon their enemies. Knights did use their swords, of course, but they were never the preferred weapon on the medieval battlefield. They sure do look good, though. Watch enough movies and TV set in the Middle Ages, and you might think that when it came to knights, the body count was pretty high. And it was, but not as high as it could have been, because there was money to be made in not killing people. Medieval warfare was a pretty expensive business, and the lords who financed them needed to pay themselves back. One way they did this was to capture knights of noble lineage, meaning their families had some cash, and holding them for ransom. Sometimes the knights were even released so they could raise the money themselves. The ransom system was well established, to the point that even ordinary soldiers sought out high-value knights on the battlefield in an effort to cash in. One warrior claimed to have been captured and ransomed 17 times. The system was so advanced that there were established rates for different ranks of prisoners and established systems of splitting ransom money within a unit. In fact, the development of rules surrounding knights and others being held for ransom in the Middle Ages laid the foundation for our modern systems regarding prisoners of war and their treatment. It's an easy mistake to make. You see someone decked out in a giant metal suit and you assume they must be carrying incredible weight. There are even long-standing myths that knights needed cranes to mount their horses because they were so heavy. But if you think about it, you'd see why that can't be true. Knights were warriors. They had to be able to move.
Twist and bend. Feel the movement.
Fighting is exhausting after all, so armor had to balance protection with mobility. Your typical full-body suit of plate armor weighed up to 60 pounds. That might sound like a lot, but armor was designed so the weight was evenly distributed, which helped. Modern soldiers routinely carry about 100 pounds of gear with them when they deploy, which puts things in perspective. I feel like you know this, but Game of Thrones and the Lord of the Rings trilogy aren't meant to be documentaries, but still, it's easy to watch their epic battle scenes and come away with the impression that knights on horseback were the most essential part of the medieval army. The fact is that while mounted knights were important, they were just one tool. While a charge by mounted knights was certainly intimidating, a disciplined group of infantrymen would actually have little trouble repelling them with spears or other long weapons. In fact, knights rarely rode their horses into battle. Mounted cavalry charges were only used in very specific situations, and horses were expensive. As time went on and the longbow was perfected, the mounted knights became even less important. But to hell with historical accuracy. If you're making a movie, thunderous cavalry charges by armored knights are undeniably cool. You've definitely seen this in a movie about the Middle Ages. The hero wades into battle and begins hacking and slashing at his armor-clad enemies, and every single warrior that his blade hits goes down screaming, despite all that armor. The movies always depict armor as essentially useless because all you have to do, apparently, is get a good slash in with your mighty and supernaturally sharp sword. So why did knights spend so much money to buy their armor and then wear all that heavy constricting metal if it were so useless? The answer, of course, is that the movies lie all the time, and it wasn't useless at all. It actually worked incredibly well. Yes, specialized weapons were developed over the years to make armor more vulnerable, like the stiletto, which was designed to slip between the seams of the armor. But more knights would usually resort to bludgeoning weapons like hammers, maces, or even the hilts of their swords. The goal was to concuss their enemies, or at least knock them down, at which point they could be more easily stabbed to death with the aforementioned stilettos, or captured and held for ransom. Crossbows could be effective against plate armor, as the powerful bolts could actually pierce metal, but only if the crossbow was fired from relatively close range. Generally speaking, plate armor worked much better than the movies want us to believe.